Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about three texts that I think have been completely ignored and overlooked and de-emphasized when it comes to studying and talking about what happened Easter morning, that is, the resurrection of Jesus. Two of these texts are from our New Testament Gospels, so you might say they're right under our noses. The third was discovered over 100 years ago, buried in a tomb in Egypt, and it also gives a report of Easter morning. So let's take a look at these three texts. Why would they be ignored? Why would they be overlooked? And I think these texts give us a completely different picture of what happened Easter morning than is the common view of both conservative Christian believers as well as apologists that put forth a certain view of Jesus's resurrection that I don't think really stands up to historical investigation. So let's take a look at these texts. I'll share my screen here. So the first one is from our earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark. What few realize in reading the Gospel of Mark is that it actually ends at this verse right here, verse 8. And even though there are three other endings that got appended to it, because those copying the manuscripts of Mark in the fourth, fifth, sixth century were not satisfied with this very abrupt ending that doesn't quite give the Easter story that people have come to believe in, had to add something. But all three of them are spurious, they're obviously forged, and the weight of scholarship today does not accept those bogus endings. So, number one, Mark 16, 1 through 8, what does it really say? Let's take a look. So, Jesus has died and he's been buried. But when that double holiday is over, the Sabbath and the Passover, we have Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James. I think that's Jesus' mother, and Salome, maybe his sister. They bought spices, so you can't buy on the Sabbath. They waited till after the Sabbath, after Passover, and their intent is to go early Sunday morning and anoint him. So very early on the first day of the week, that's Sunday, we call it Easter Sunday, they went to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the door of the tomb? And looking up, so as they get to the tomb, they look up and they see that the stone was already rolled back. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting there on the right side, dressed in a white robe. Now, notice it doesn't say an angel or anything dazzling. There's just someone in the tomb. And they were amazed. What happened? The young man says to the women, don't be amazed. Basically, yeah, the body is gone. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who is crucified. He has risen, or literally been lifted up. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples, and Peter, particularly Peter is designated, that he will go before you to Galilee and you'll see him there. As he told you. So this is in the Gospel of Mark. Earlier, Jesus had said, after I die, I'll see you in Galilee. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So, believe it or not, my friends, that's how Mark originally ended. There are no sightings, there are no appearances. They simply find a tomb that's already been opened, the body is gone, and the messenger that's there, the young man, not an angel, says, don't be surprised. He's been taken up and he's not here. See the place where they laid him. So that's the first text. Okay, the second text are the first 10 verses of John chapter 20. And I think there's good evidence that this is what I would call an embedded earlier tradition. Just the first 10 verses. After verse 10, it goes on with the standard Easter story. But look at just the first 10 verses, and you're going to see a very similar account to Mark. Early on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb. Now, it doesn't mention the other women. Maybe they got there later. Maybe this particular tradition doesn't know of the other women. But either way, Notice it's still dark, Sunday morning. The stone is already taken away, same thing. So she goes to Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. I think that's James, but again, I've done other programs on that and written about it and so forth. And she said to them, notice I've underlined it, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid them. So, what you got to ask is, who is the they? People talk about who moved the stone, who moved the body. Well, whoever they is took the body out of the tomb, according to her impression, and we don't know where they took him. And we'll explain that as we go on. Well, Peter is very excited about that, as is the other disciple, and they run top speed towards the tomb. So I think it is on the Mount of Olives. And the second disciple outran Peter and gets to the tomb first, and he stoops down and looks in, and he sees these linen clothes lying there, but he doesn't go in. And I think I know the reason for that, because I think he's a priestly person, James the Just, and doesn't enter a tomb during Passover. Then Simon Peter came. Now he's impulsive, and he darts right into the tomb, and he checks it out, and there's a linen clothes lying around and a napkin. It's the headpiece of a shroud. I talked recently on a video about the Tomb of the Shroud, where we found the only burial shroud ever dated to the first century. It's got a body piece as well as a headpiece, and that had been on his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in. So he finally goes in, and he saw and believed. So he hesitates at first, but then he goes in. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So when it says he believed, it doesn't mean he believed in the resurrection. It means he believes that the body's been moved, as he's been taken for a kind of a reburial. So there it is, right in the Gospel of John. And then notice this. Then the disciples went back to their homes. And literally in Greek, it's to their own places. Well, that would be in the Galilee. So if you just take these 10 verses, the empty tomb is discovered by Mary Magdalene, maybe the women later with her. Simon and the other disciple check it out. They confirm that it's true, and then they go back to their homes. Now, I'm just talking about those first 10 verses. If you read them now with the rest of John 20 and John 21, of course, that's not the story. But that's why I think this is overlooked. It's a set story. It has a beginning and an ending, and I think it is the earliest tradition of what happened Easter morning. Now, I suppose if that's all we had, it would be enough. But fortunately, in 1886, in Egypt, buried with a monk, are fragments of the lost Gospel of Peter. Now, scholars differ about this document. It's mentioned in antiquity as the Gospel of Peter. Some scholars think that it's derivative from our Gospels, kind of cobbled together, even though it's a little different. But others have argued the opposite, and I'm persuaded of this view, that it actually is independent of the synoptic tradition because it's too different. But what it does record is very similar to the final verses of Mark, those final 8 verses, and the first 10 verses of John. And I don't think that can be accidental. But wait till you see what else it says if you've never read it. So Mary Magdalene and her women friends go to the tomb at dawn. They find the sepulcher open. There we go again. So the stone is already open or moved. And having come forward, they bent down and saw there, but there's a young man seated inside. He's in the middle, and he's clothed with a splendid robe. So he's well dressed. And he says, "Why have you come? Whom do you seek? Not the one who is crucified. He is risen and gone away." Now, notice that, gone away. Isn't that interesting? But if you do not believe, bend down and see the place where he lay, because he's not here. For he's risen and gone away from there whence he was sent. It's a little strange English, but the idea as he's gone, he's been taken up to heaven. And the women fled frightened. So that's very similar to Mark. But notice this is new. Now, it was the final day of unleavened bread. This is later. The first day of unleavened bread is the Passover. Then you had the Sabbath. This is 8 days later. This is a week later. Final day of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread lasts 7 days in the Hebrew Bible. And many are returning home. The feast is over. Passover lasts 8 days. But we 12 disciples of the Lord were weeping and sorrowful. Now, if they've seen Jesus all week and had all of these appearances, why would they be weeping and sorrowful? They're sorrowful because of what had come to pass. So they each departed to his home, very similar to Mark. They go home. The tomb is empty. They go home. They don't have faith yet in the resurrection. But I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew, having taken our nets, went off to sea. So Peter says basically, I'm going fishing. I'm going back to my life. And then it breaks off, mentions Levi of Alphaeus, whom the Lord, whatever. But notice, he goes off fishing. Now, I presume if it continued, because this is all we have at the end, that they would have gone to Galilee, and up in Galilee, they would begin to experience these apparitions or appearances, or I like to call them sightings of Jesus, and they would come to believe that he'd been exalted to heaven. I think that's the heart and soul of the original early Christian faith. So when they get to the tomb, the body's taken away. Now, notice what happens over the years, over the decades. Matthew writes, Luke writes, John writes. We saw how Mark ended. The story expands, it gets embellished, it becomes very legendary. Look at the difference. None of this is in those three passages, not any of this. They come and visit the tomb Sunday morning. There's an earthquake. An angel descends. The angel is glorious. It rolls back the stone. So the stone's not already back, but they experience this earthquake. And then the Roman guards pass out. Remember, the tomb has been sealed, according to Matthew, with plaster, and the Roman guards, and they pass out like they're dead. And the women run away, but they meet Jesus. So that doesn't fit what we see in the other accounts. Nobody's meeting Jesus. And then the 11 apostles see Jesus in Galilee, but notice some doubted. So whatever they saw, it's not exactly clear. And then two men in dazzling apparel appear to them in the tomb. So here's an angel descends. Now two men in dazzling clothing. Sounds almost like they might be angels. And then Jesus appears to two of them on the road to Emmaus. He appears later to the apostles on Sunday, the very day of Easter. 8 days later, according to the Gospel of Peter, they've gone home after weeping and sorrowing and despair for 8 days. But here, according to this story, he appears to them again and he tells them not to leave Jerusalem. That's in Luke. Whereas in the other accounts, they go back home to the Galilee. And finally, they return home and they see Jesus on the shores of the Galilee. So you can see all of this embellishment. I think that material is not historical. You can tell it's legendary, it's mythological, gets ramped up with more and more supernatural events, and it just doesn't hold up for historical critical studies. Now, here's what people have overlooked. Why do those first three accounts make sense in terms of what might really have happened Easter morning? Here's why. In Mark 15, and Mark's the one who gives this very clearly, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the council, looking for the kingdom, so he's sympathetic to Jesus, he got his courage up and he went to the Roman prefect or governor, Pontius Pilate, and he asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate's surprised that he's already dead. He checks with the centurion in charge of the crucifixion, and he grants Joseph to have the body. Joseph is probably part of the family. There is some later Christian tradition that he's related actually to Mary, and that would make sense. I'm not saying that's in this text, but he has some connection. He buys a linen shroud, takes the body down, wraps him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. Now, Luke adds, where no one had ever been laid, and that fits what we're going to see also in the Gospel of John. And he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Now, notice he does not say it's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Joseph gets the body and puts it in a tomb. And in this passage, which it seems like everybody ignores, John says, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. So Luke also records that, but John comes after Luke. So, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. This is a temporary emergency burial at Golgotha, at the place of crucifixion. Now, obviously, Joseph of Arimathea doesn't have a family tomb at the place of crucifixion. I don't think he lives up there with his family. Family tombs are typically on the property of a family. And so we can see that this is an emergency burial. You can't have predators violating the body of Jesus, the corpse, over the 2-day holiday. You got the Passover itself as well as the Sabbath. But at the first opportunity, Saturday night, and notice next, and on the first day of the week, this is the first 10 verses of John again. Verse 1, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early. So the intention, they bought spices, is let's finish the rites of burial. But when they get there to finish the rites of burial, the body's gone. Where have they taken him? The burial party has already moved the body. You would think most likely Saturday night. You don't wait another 12 hours when the body is decaying. You want to get it into a tomb. And we would presume that it was buried on the land of Joseph of Arimathea. He's taken charge of the burial. And as a wealthy man, he would likely provide a tomb on his own property for Jesus and his family. So here's the most likely scenario, taking into account these three overlooked and neglected texts. Jesus is removed from the cross around 3 p.m. before sunset, with Passover and Sabbath beginning at sunset. Perfect sense. The holiday's coming. You can't put a corpse in your house or outside your house on the Passover. Everybody's ritually purified, ready to eat the Passover. And a sorrowful Passover it must have been that night. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy sympathizer, obtains the body, and he puts it temporarily in a nearby unused tomb and blocks it up till after Passover and the Sabbath. Saturday evening at sunset, the Joseph of Arimathea party comes and removes the body, burying it in a permanent place, most likely on his own property. Mary Magdalene and the women come early Sunday morning before dawn, only to find the stone removed and the body taken away for permanent burial. The disciples and the family weep and mourn his death for 7 days through unleavened bread following the Passover. They return to the Galilee where they begin to experience sightings of Jesus. If you go to 1 Corinthians 15, you get the earliest account of who saw Jesus when. Peter's first, and then the 12 apostles, and then whole groups of people, finally James and other apostles, and then finally Paul himself says he's also seen Jesus. Paul's actually our earliest witness in terms of literary composition. 1 Corinthians 15 is earlier than any of our gospel accounts. And what does he say? I've seen the Lord. Well, the Lord that he saw was a glorified heavenly Christ that's been exalted to heaven according to his belief and his faith. And he says it's not flesh and blood. The resurrection body is a life-giving spirit. That would be what they saw when they got back to Galilee. They began to have sightings of this glorified Christ seated at the right hand of God and so forth. We've actually got one of those visions in Acts chapter 7. And in that chapter in Acts, we have the tragic, brutal death of Stephen, one of the early followers of Jesus, and he's stoned to death brutally by a mob. And he looks up and he has a vision of Jesus at the right hand of God. That's the kind of experience the disciples had, and it fits perfectly these texts. So if you take these three texts, the first 8 verses of Mark, the first 10 verses of John, and you add to it the Gospel of Peter, I think you get a pretty good handle on what really happened Easter morning. Basically, the body was removed from the temporary tomb, it was reburied, but faith in resurrection only began back in the Galilee when people began to have visions of the glorified, resurrected Christ, as Paul did and as he describes. And remember, he equates his visions of Christ to that of the apostles. So think about that. These are the texts, and this is the emphasis that you normally do not get Easter morning. Easter morning, you get this, which is the embellishment, the expansion of the story for apologetic reasons. And the argument develops that Jesus' resurrection is a resuscitated corpse. That's not the view of the earliest texts, as we can see here. I'll stop the share. So take care, everybody. I hope you found that thought-provoking and interesting.